Oh my gosh, you guys. Oh my gosh, I am so excited to do this theory. I've had a lot of harsh criticisms for the Netflix series The OA and how essentially I made a theory or several 10 theories where I say I think OA is a delusional liar. And the internet flocked to her defense, claiming that the government was in on the testing and thereby covered it up, that the power of the movements showed that the other side is real, that there's no way OA could fake a nosebleed. The list went on and on and on. And at the time, those counter arguments didn't mean a whole lot, but then my son started to watch Stranger Things. This one, the teenager, not the baby. And that prompted me to rewatch the series myself for the third time. Government testing, overzealous government cover-ups, other dimensions, superhuman beings who have nosebleeds when their powers are enacted. It's like the protesters to my OA videos use Stranger Things to fill in the story gaps. And it doesn't not fit. So are Stranger Things and the OA universe in the same timeline? I actually think that the answer could be yes, and I will suspend my disbelief of OA and take all of her story at face value to make this theory. Stranger Things is set in roughly 1982, maybe 1983. I come up with this date because Will's mom, Joyce, has a flashback to getting tickets for the Poltergeist movie for Will. Flashback Will doesn't look any younger, and at his age, this kid's physical appearance is going to change a lot from year to year. Wait for season 2, you'll see what I mean. Now, Poltergeist released on June 4th, 1982, and the end of Stranger Things tells us that Will disappeared around Thanksgiving as the 1 month later ending moments repeatedly beat it over our heads that it's now Christmas time. Now, the OA, for all intents and purposes, takes place in 2016, the release date for season 1. Obviously, a lot of the captivity scenes occur well before that, but all of the present day scenes should be assumed as current day, as the show never tells us any differently. OA is 29 years old, which is provable through clues in the show that talk about when OA was abducted, and that means she was born in 1987. Now, that does not give OA a solid connection to the Stranger Things kids, but that still links her back to the 80s and the Cold War era. What we know at the end of Stranger Things is that the Demogorgon is not fully defeated. Elle has vanished, likely to be in the Upside Down, and the Department of Energy is still doing whatever they want, basically, in the background. It's not fully confirmed, but it is heavily implied that Hopper is working for the DOE on the side now, as he knows where to drop food for, I assume, Elle. And the DOE took Hopper for a car ride outside of the hospital, but obviously didn't kill him, which would be the easiest thing for them to do, so the government has found some use for Hopper in some capacity. We're also shown that Will is now basically Catbug, and he uncontrollably jumps between dimensions. And we see that there's a very different world between physically and mentally traveling to the Upside Down. You know, how Will actually goes there and the place is all ashy and barren. But when Elle travels as an out-of-body experience, it's just all black and kind of wet. Speaking of which, Elle seems to see the Upside Down in a very near-death experience, NDE kind of way. Yes, the DOE lets Elle breathe while in the sensory deprivation tank, but Elle's nosebleeds are shown to be severe and even knock her out when enough energy is used. Is it possible that Elle briefly dies during these blackouts? The more frequently the blackouts occur, the more Elle's powers seem to grow. It's almost as if she's not just expelling energy to use her powers, but that she's gaining more power every time she blacks out. This is very similar to what the show The OA finds on the other side, where the captives are given abilities, healed, and shown movements after various visits. The powers of the captives grew when they went to the other side, very similarly to how Elle's powers expand every time she blacks out. I mean, Elle goes from not being able to crush a soda can to stopping a fan to ripping apart a store, breaking kids' arms, and killing people. This girl is leveling up exponentially every time she passes out. Okay, let's talk about the Cold War end of things for a second. Stranger Things shows us a Russian man speaking in the Upside Down, which strongly implies that the DOE's motive is to find a way to spy on the USSR and the KGB, which was like the Soviet Union's version of the CIA. I would guess that the Upside Down was the US's attempt at covertly spying on Russia without any risk of getting caught, since the spies would be in another dimension that no one else could see or proves exists. But the most important thing that I want to touch on is that the Cold War lasted from 1947 to 1991. Now, in the OA, the character Hap isn't formally given an age, but we can estimate that Hap is in his 50s since the actor Jason Isaacs is 53. That age range would make Hap in his 20s during the 80s, which would be just old enough to work for the government in Cold War experiments. After all, when you're dealing with people who have supernatural powers, you certainly want a few staffers on your team who can safely sedate your assets immediately. So an anesthesiologist, like Hap said to be, would be a very useful person to hire. This would also put Hap into a timeline where he'd have a reason to be obsessive with his research of NDEs and the other side, and a much better story than the one we're given in the OA, which is basically that Hap heard a dead patient make a whoosh noise right before he came back to life. I mean, that might spark some curiosity, sure, but not enough to halt your entire life, go live out in the mountains like a hermit, and start capturing people. And as many have speculated on my OA theories, there's a strong belief that the government, particularly the FBI, is trying to support and cover up Hap's experiments. People have said that the FBI counselor isn't real, that the books in OA's room were planted, even that her parents were in on the entire ordeal. It sounds absolutely crazy to me with the amount of evidence that we see in the OA series. But if we expand the view to include Stranger Things, it gets a lot more interesting. When World War II ended, the chemical warfare industry turned to making pesticides and household cleaning supplies. Why? Well, because after the need for making weapons withered away at the end of the war, we had a number of scientists with very specialized skills who now had no job prospects. So they found themselves a place in the market and gave us gems like DDT and systemic pesticides. Now, the Cold War went on much, much longer than the US's involvement in World War II. We're talking about 44 years here. And when the Cold War ended, I imagine we had similar issues where companies and government departments had employees with very specific skill sets that now had no job and no other field to turn to. So if you're in the habit of looking for a way to dimensionally travel, but you no longer need it for spying on the Ruskies, what do? Well, if you're smart, you're going to look for a new angle to sell to the government to keep yourself employed. Since we no longer need to study superpowers in relation to spying, let's study how we perform interdimensional travel via NDEs, or just the extent of humans with superpowers and their capabilities instead. That scenario would fit decently with the OA's storyline and explain why Hap knew at least one other researcher doing the same type of death study. It's similar to how some soldiers will retire from the military and then get job offers to be a private contractor with the government doing the same work they were doing for a lot less in the military. I'm suggesting that Hap went from being a Cold War era researcher / anesthesiologist to a private researcher funded and protected by the government. But that would also mean that Hap should be somewhat aware-ish, depending on when he worked for the DOE, that physical travel across dimensions is dangerous. You know, there's monsters in there and stuff. I am very interested to see what Season 2 of the OA offers about Hap and the captives' movement into the other side, and if it's a comparable difference to the safer out-of-body traveling we see during NDEs. At any rate, though, altering the motive and method of the research to keep the work alive is very common, and something that would have easily happened to a number of Cold War-era studies. Food for thought. Since spies were believed to be everywhere, it's likely to assume that at some point, the KGB found out about the work the DOE was doing, and they started their own quest for superhumans and finding otherworldly ways to spy on their enemies. Not only was the USSR involved in the Cold War with the United States in the 80s, they were also in the Soviet-Afghan War through 1989. And again, after the wars, what happened to all of the USSR's work on secret projects like this? It probably evolved and continued too, right? Or maybe a better way to put this question, was OA's bus crash a mafia hit, as she believes, or was Russia also conducting their research on people with abilities, and they took out the bus driver to see what OA would or could do under duress? That might explain why OA's story had no police on the scene when she woke up on the shore, and why there were no other parents or survivors present. It was all a very controlled test for the OA, and the other children were just expendable, just like the bus driver. Alternatively, it's possible that Russia gave up on their superhuman research, and OA accidentally stumbled onto the remnants of a multidimensional pathway. I mean, really, if we look at OA's NDEs versus L's sensory deprivation trips to the Upside Down, they're basically the same, minus some stars in the sky. And yes, OA's perception of the other side does change over time, and she sees the field of flowers and whatnot, but that was a whole separate room. We don't know what Elle could have found if she had gone back to the Upside Down more and more and more frequently with the sensory deprivation tank. Any which way you look at it, though, I find it highly interesting that in Stranger Things, Elle is trying to find a pathway to spy on the Russians, and she finds a man speaking Russian on the other side. And OA crosses over and meets a woman who speaks Arabic when Russia would have been recently exiting a very ugly war with Afghanistan. True, for anyone that knows their information, Arabic is not a main language in Afghanistan. But America could say the same thing of Japanese, yet still find many people who know it as their first or second language. So likewise, you will find people in Afghanistan who speak Arabic, and according to Google, 420 million people speak Arabic today, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that some of those people were in Afghanistan during the 80s. Or maybe Khatun was a spy. I mean, I don't know, but it's interesting at least, and the possibility for a connection is right there. Plus, we have no clue how many languages Khatun might have known, so I'm putting my foot down that this is an eerie similarity. And okay, it's also true that OA relies on movements for many of her powers, but she also has nosebleed-inducing premonitions that happened decades before she knew what the movements were. So if we believe OA's stories, she has supernatural powers that are independent of traveling to the other side, just like Elle has. The powers are not all the same, but it could be that their mothers both had similar backgrounds. We know very little about OA's biological mother, but we know Elle's mom was part of a mind control experiment called MK Ultra, which allegedly gave Elle her powers. Now, the KGB was notoriously believed to watch all of their citizens, tap phones, and do all the things that prior to 9/11, American citizens would have been outraged by. So, assuming that the KGB did get intelligence from the DOE we see in Stranger Things, that means that the Russians would also be repeating the same types of experiments, hoping to find some alternate dimension where they could also spy on the Americans. And that all means that it's not too far-fetched for OA's bio-mom to have been another test subject who just happened to give birth to another child with special abilities. I mean, we know L is short for 11, and that implies heavily that she is the 11th test subject, so they have other people with other powers in the DOE in Stranger Things. And the Russians during the Cold War were stereotyped with not really valuing the lives of their own people very much, so just imagine how many test subjects Russia might have had. The only difference is that somehow OA managed to go home with her father, whereas 11 was stored in a facility like a lab rat. Why that happened, I'm not sure. But this marks another example of where the plot of Stranger Things explains a plot hole in the OA. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed enough to like, subscribe, and share this video. I've also got a lot of other videos on my channel that you are fully encouraged to go check out. Plus, you can find me on Facebook at Say Halo Goodbye, which is my gamer tag, or Twitter at _Fanily.